Thank you so much for coming to this distinguished, beautiful building and institution. This portrait of Betty is, as you may have gathered, is part of a 4-part biography. They didn't know each other. Leonard Bernstein, great musician, Norman Mailer, great writer. His reputation needs a little refurbishing at this point. Betty Friedan, feminist revolutionary bourgeois division. Her reputation needs a little upgrading as well. And Mel Brooks, who turns 100 on June 26th. And if I can do a self-plug, Judd Apatow, wonderful writer, producer's made a 4-hour documentary about Mel's life, which is on HBO. You can download it. I'm in the second half, holding forth on that bizarre episode from History of the World, Part 1, called the Inquisition. It's a musical number in which Jews are strung up on the walls and tormented in various ways, while Mel, as Torquemada, does dances in front of all of them, I spent a fair amount of time in this text trying to understand what in the world he was doing with this outlandish number. Anyway, so they didn't know each other. I mean, they clinked glasses at parties in New York. I have the feeling that there was a lot of heavy drinking in artistic, intellectual, even university circles in the 50s and 60s. It was a kind of minor form of rebellion against what many, certainly liberals, took as a time of conformity. The Eisenhower presidency, I wouldn't mind having Eisenhower as president right now. McCarthyism, the massive, consumerism as a way of life, and overwhelming us, and so on. But I thought they had certain temperamental affinities. So I set myself a kind of time frame, which was that they had to be born after the First World War and they had to mature after the Second World War. And why? Because in 1948, the whole media picture sort of changed. If we got the long-playing record, you can imagine Leonard Bernstein's career without the long-playing record. We had television as a mass medium, and the paperback, the mass market paperback, which was very important for Betty. I was thinking of Jews in the diaspora after 70 AD, and there were some periods of relative calm and sufficiency in Spain and England. The revolutionary France emancipated the Jews in the sense of giving them rights as citizens. I think it's 1791 or 1792. In later 19th century big cities like Vienna, Budapest, London, Paris, it was possible to have, if you were Jewish, to have a male, of course, male Jewish, to have a professional career. I mean, Freud being the most celebrated example, but you had to obey so many rules. And all those situations, except for England, ended disastrously, as I don't have to tell you, with expulsion or worse. They lived, so to speak, in those cultures on sufferance. You can stay here if you do this and if you do that. And the places where they don't live on sufferance are, of course, Israel and the United States. And I want to read something that a certain president wrote the Jewish community in 1794. And of course, it's George Washington, and the community was in Rhode Island, Newport. And they had helped him in their modest way in his run for the presidency. And he wrote that there was a correspondence back and forth. And Washington wrote, "All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as it was by the indulgence of one class of people, sufferance, that another enjoy the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry, happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection shall demean themselves as good citizens. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. Exactly. That was the way the chief executive of the United States government once thought was appropriate to speak to an embattled community. All right, come forward now to after World War II. And anti-Semitism is in retreat, in part because of Jewish organizations' horror over what we later called the Holocaust. It was obvious to anyone who would look at it that the Jewish community in this country was doing well. Simon Kuznets, the Nobel economist, did make studies of comparative income and so on, but most people, the Jews rather, didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to draw attention. I mean, they weren't prospering in legacy industries like oil and steel and railways, but in businesses of all kinds of retail businesses, particularly entertainment, the universities, teaching at every level, sciences and humanities. There was a distinguished group of intellectuals in New York, the so-called New York intellectuals, starting in the late 30s, who established literary standards in many ways, toughened up standards in this country. Then there was, of course, the magical Catskills, 100 miles northwest of New York, where pale Jewish bodies from many neighborhoods could get a little sun and meet people. See, most people, working class and lower middle class Jews, married only within their communities. By going to the Catskills, they met people from other towns, other states. It was, one of the greatest marriage markets of all time. And of course, all the comics performed there, including Mel Brooks, starting at 14, where he met Sid Caesar, who was 17, I believe. Almost the same, a few years older. All right, all of that was happening at once in the post-war period. So my idea was, how would Jews behave when they enjoyed, for good or for ill, a freedom they had never really enjoyed anywhere before? In other words, the book is a study of liberty, with all the errors, the waywardness, the selfishness that liberty allows, as well as the great creativity and endless displays of energy for those who were gifted, especially gifted. So there are four parallel narratives. Well, parallel isn't even the right word. I wanted each one to have its own integrity. I didn't fashion them so intentionally so they would shine light on each other. I hoped it would happen just as in the writing, as unintentionally, so to speak, that certain elements of the culture at that time and certain elements of their own temperament would link up. So that was the general idea of the book. Here are the four of them, thanks to David Levine's characters, all published in the New York Review of Books in the 60s and 70s. Cultural conservative in the Wall Street Journal named Joseph Epstein said that I was nothing, these four were nothing, and the caricatures were anti-Semitic, and I should be reported to the Anti-Defamation League. So I packed up the book the day the newspaper came out and sent it to them, and they wrote back and said, "We have no problem with these caricatures. We're eager to read your book, end of story." But anyway, Betty, February 4th, 1921, Peoria, 130 miles south of Chicago, second biggest town in Illinois. I think it still is. I'm not sure of that, but it had a kind of amused reputation. The marketing, will it play in Peoria, which is a little bit unfair. Meaning it's such a square town. Will this commercial or this movie or this whatever it is play? It's not quite fair. It was a river town, still is, and it had gambling houses and brothels, and so there was a slightly wild side to Peoria, but it was the culture was dominated by the Protestant churches, and I would think you could generalize there was a conservative social ethos. Betty's mother, Miriam, was a smart and beautiful woman. Her parents, she wanted to go to Smith, and she certainly would have gotten in. Her parents said, no, you have to stay home and go to a local college. She worked in the local newspaper on the women's page. She loved being a newspaper person. She married Harry Goldstein, who was 20 years older, a widower. He was from Kiev. Harry was intellectually very capable and really became Betty's intellectual companion. Miriam disapproved of her daughter. She wasn't pretty. Her room was a mess. She wasn't well coordinated enough to play tennis and golf and the things that Miriam wanted to, get her to do. Dancing lessons. Betty liked to hike. She was a brilliant student. She did go to Smith with Miriam's, not Harry's, Miriam's help and approval. And Miriam is, I think, the key person here because Miriam was the model of the intelligent, educated, landlocked suburban or small city woman that Betty wrote about in the Feminine Mystique years later. She lived until 90, by the way. She buried Harry and buried 2 other husbands and was still going in her 90s in an assisted living community in Los Angeles. At Smith, Betty was a brilliant student. Other girls, women would come to her and chat her up at 2 in the morning in her room to, just talk about politics and so on. She got a big fellowship to go to Berkeley in psychology. And it didn't take. She was bored. She liked being the center of attention at Smith, and the action at Berkeley in the late 30s was not in psychology. It was in that building up on the hill. Have any of you seen the movie Oppenheimer? Of course. That was Berkeley in the late 30s. John Kenneth Galbraith, certainly not a physicist, said to be at Berkeley in the late 30s was heaven. Anyway, there were a couple of physics students that were interested in her, and she was interested in them, but nothing really took. So she picked herself up and moved to New York, to the Village, lived on Grove Street with other Smith people, and worked. She desperately needed a job, worked for trade union papers, including the Electricians Union, which was a fairly left-wing big union with some communists among the leaders and members. Was sort of broken by the FBI and the AFL-CIO, the communist part of it, a few years later. Betty was no communist. She was I would say, a middle-class liberal. I mean, she twice tried to join the party, once in Berkeley and once in New York off Union Square, and she was nicely dressed and was laughed out of the office both times. So that was not right for her, as she well knew. She was temperamentally very tough on herself. She was, I'm going to indulge a few sentences of Jewish chauvinism for which I do not expect to be forgiven, but I need you to hear this because it relates to these 4. There's a Hasidic tale about Rabbi Zusya, and there's nothing in the Old Testament about the afterlife. It's in the rabbinical writings, the Talmud. There's nothing in the Old Testament about it, but apparently Zusya believed in the afterlife, or at least for the sake of this anecdote. And he said, when I get to heaven, they're not going to say to me, why weren't you Moses? They're going to say to me, why weren't you Zusya? Meaning, why weren't you the best version of yourself, or a better version of yourself? This is a kind of Jewish demon. It's different than certainly different than self-overcoming or self-transcendence. It's a little more worldly. It means making the most of your capacities, and it's a kind of it can, and it's produced, you know, you could write a book about what produces such a notion. I mean, it's produced by being outsiders and by being afraid a lot of the time, and feeling that you have to make the most of your opportunities, and contempt for people, you know, Luftmenschendick, who were not focused, and together in all of that. She was very guilty, Betty, if she wasn't using her capacities to their maximum. She worked for, she got out of the trade union publications, worked for women's magazines, which were very important in the post-war period. I mean, there were more of them, and they were big, fat things with enormous circulation. I guess Vogue is still around, and a couple of the others are still around, but some of them are gone. Women, what am I trying to say? Ladies' Home Journal and Red Book, a few others. They had circulations of 6 and 7 million copies a month, and they paid well, and all sorts of good people, you know, like Mary McCarthy and so on, wrote for them on occasion. And so she became a very expert journalist, and she did profiles and so on, and she wrote about women who were wives and mothers, and also did something on the side that was quite unusual, without some sort of business or enterprise, or even if it was volunteer work. And inevitably, her editors would turn those pieces back into happy homemaker pieces, which of course enraged her. They wouldn't allow that valence of women's activity into those magazines. And this is the late 50s we're talking about, and middle 50s. So in 1956, she did a survey of her class at Smith. There was a kind of nasty trope that was going around in journalism. It came out of a book that was a big bestseller, that the notion that college education made women unhappy. Not only that, they had bad sex. Not only that, they drove their husbands crazy. There was a lot of this in journalism, and so part of her intention of talking to her classmates was to see how they felt about their lives, and those who were most busy and active were the happiest. So certainly no one said that their education was making them unhappy. So she turned it around and wrote an article saying that women weren't taking college education seriously enough. That article was turned down everywhere. Everywhere. And these were not stupid men who ran these magazines, but but how cautious they were about delivering a certain message. So she had an agent, and she got a contract at Norton Books, which then as now, or now as then, is a serious publisher, generally of nonfiction. And 5 or 6 years later, we get the Feminine Mystique, which was published in 1963 during the newspaper strike. Still sold 60,000 copies, which is actually very good, although Betty and her husband drove the publisher nuts by calling over and over again. The year after, it was published by Dell in a mass market paperback. You remember, in the old days, at the head of a drugstore or a supermarket, there would be those circular metal racks, and you'd have maybe a couple of Shakespeare plays and maybe a novel by John Steinbeck, and you had Betty Friedan, and it sold 1 million copies. And the publisher at Norton took her out, and eventually sold 3 million in mass market paperback, and said, let's talk about your next book. And she said, there isn't going to be a next book with you. You made me feel like such a Jew for trying to push the feminine mystique. And then she used a common expletive, which means get lost. The book caused a sensation, and even women who didn't read it but heard that there was a kind of compact ideology that existed in movies and television shows, in psychiatry, in the sermons of rabbis, priests, and ministers, that women were best suited for homemaking, and and mothering, and were doomed for unhappiness if they did something much more aggressive. And people who just heard about that notion, women who heard about this notion, were struck by it. It meant something to it. There's a whole book that's been written by Stephanie Coombs just about the reaction to the book. She said she wanted to awaken the sleeping beauties, and she did. Now, of course, the great book prior to hers was Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which was finished in 1949 in France and published here in 1953. And Betty drew on it. All the feminist writers drew on it, sometimes with open acknowledgement, sometimes not so openly. But de Beauvoir was a great intellectual, and her study drew on history, anthropology, philosophy, literature. She was a polymath. And the book was fairly widely read, but it was Betty's book that launched second wave feminism in the early 60s, not Simone de Beauvoir's. Why? Because she exercised the abilities of a professional journalist. She went around and talked to people, and she encountered women on the East Coast mainly. Sometimes the south. She went south, but she didn't go very far west. And the complaint about the book, then as now, it's factually true, but it's intellectually wrong. The complaint about it always was that her data sample was other women like herself. They were white, middle, and upper middle class suburban women all over the East Coast and the Southeast. It did not include women of color. It did not include working class women who had to work, whether they wanted to or not, whether they met opposition or not, they had to work to survive. And that is true as a description of her method and of her subject. But where it misses the point is that she also read the entire culture. And it's very much worth reading, by the way. I've read it twice. I didn't read it certainly when it came out, but I've read it the last time was maybe 5 years ago, and I'm still very much engaged with the feminine mystique. She read the entire culture. She looked at the movies, she looked at television. She, as I said before, she looked at this, studied psychiatry, religion, and so on. And there were so-called experts, all male, and well, not all male. Some were female, also making generalizations about women's character in general. In other words, not just about class. A class group, but about women in general. And it was that she was opposed to, and it was that caused, I think, people who just even heard about the book to be interested in it. She enjoyed her celebrity. She flew everywhere. She gave sort of angry interviews to local television stations and newspapers, which was the way you sold books. In 1963, 64, 65, all of that is gone. And the other great thing she did was that she was an organizer. And there was the National Organization for Women in 1966, which was started in Washington. There was a kind of underground of women working in the Johnson administration, in the Labor Department, in the Justice Department, who felt that women's rights had to be represented publicly in a way that was not inadequate even in the Great Society period. What she and Pauli Murray, an African-American lawyer, and others thought was needed was a kind of civil rights organization for women, comparable to what African-Americans had built. And they were and still exists, was concerned with changing the law, anti-discrimination laws. That was its primary focus, hiring, prejudicial hiring and advertising and so on, which put women in separate categories, ending the male dominance of certain industries, including liberal institutions like Newsweek, for instance. I know someone who played a big role in the strike at Newsweek. And the other thing about that I'm very grateful for is that in Betty's feminism and in Now, was that men had to be part of the revolution as far as she was concerned. The organizing statement, which I've looked at her notes and at the Schlesinger Library up at Harvard, they have, many feet of Betty papers, and I've got a lot of interesting stuff from there. She kept writing and rewriting the opening statement of the National Organization for Women, and it turned out, we, men and women, who hereby constitute ourselves the National Organization for Women, believe that the time has come for a new movement towards true equality for all women in America and toward a fully equal partnership of the sexes as part of the worldwide revolution of human rights now taking place within and beyond our national border. So the men part of it was right there in the founding statement, and as I said, personally, I found it a relief, because it tended to relieve, at least among my circle of friends, of men, of the burdens of sort of traditional performative macho. Look no further than the Secretary of War to see the current disgraceful version of it. In 1967, she got behind the Equal Rights Amendment, right, which still, has never been passed. And although it came very close, her advocacy did not include rights for gay women at that time, and it said nothing about protections for women against harassment and rape. And these omissions may have been partly driven by her own situation. She had a kind of anti-lesbian fixation, which she said was part of her small city upbringing. I don't know what, I think it's more than that. But she thought the FBI was infiltrating the women's movement with gay women and so on and so forth, which is just foolish, because how do you have a women's movement without gay women? I mean, it was just politically foolish, among other things. And she finally gave it up and made a speech that left everyone in tears. And by the late 60s, you know the plot. The women's movement moved towards women's liberation. It moved left. And Betty hated all the varieties of radical feminism. The notion that the family was the prison house of Western culture and women had to raise children by themselves. Well, there are a lot of women raising children by themselves at the moment, and it's not probably for ideological reasons. It's more to do with men are not worthy partners, or just it's cheaper somehow. In other words, it's economic-driven behavior. She thought consciousness raising was just she didn't understand that women needed to talk to one another. That they needed to converse. I mean, everything had to be organized towards a political end, in her opinion. Assault the Congress, assault the city council, whatever. But that notion that a revolution occurred because women got together in a room and had the kind of conversations they had never had before about work, about sex, about many things, that she thought was all nonsense. She thought of feminism as a kind of mighty river with Betty Friedan as the captain, going down the river, whereas actually it was breaking out in rivulets on all sides of the river. This was before abortion was legal, there were abortion clinics, there were women's publications, there was changes in the professions, and so on. She sort of didn't understand that part of the women's movement, and she greatly resented Gloria Steinem, who, of course, as well as being a very beautiful woman, was very shrewd about how to use her fame, and also very generous. if she was in New York and if there was a group of women in a small city in, you know, Ohio who were trying to form a group, she would fly out there and help them if she could. I mean, that was not the kind of thing that Betty Friedan did. And the other one, of course, was Bella Abzug, who was a congresswoman in my neighborhood and would interrupt my breakfast when I was trying to, in the late 60s, early 70s, when I was having breakfast alone somewhere out, suddenly this big face would come over my newspaper. And Bella was funny and direct and humorous about herself, and you know, and she was one of my subjects. Norman Mailer wrote memorably affectionate descriptions of Betty. She came when he ran for mayor, Mailer, and he wanted her vote, and they talked together, and he wrote about her manner of her wall slamming style of attack. Well, around that same time, Betty was at a friend's house for dinner, and she was Bella, and she was carrying forth, and she slammed her hand down on the dining table, and it split. So it was table slamming style as well. And Betty greatly resented the two of them, and you know, wrote nasty things about them in the Times when she had access to the Times and so on. It's a sad story. She continued on for 30 years more and traveled all over the world, talking to groups of women in Israel particularly. She sort of sparked feminist movement in Israel. She continued to fight for the ERA, for abortion rights, and her two obsessions: the necessity for feminist women to have children. Absolutely believed in that, and a lot of younger women didn't want to be lectured on these. They might want children, they might not. They didn't want to be lectured on this issue. And then, of course, the other thing was to try to change the culture of the workplace. Betty went to Sweden in 1967, and the Swedish feminists said, "This is all very well, Mrs. Friedan, but without universal child care, it's all just talk." And that's wrong. It's not all just talk, but they certainly have a point. And you know, here the mayor of New York right now is trying to get universal pre-K child care for 2-year-olds. This is what Betty was obsessed with in the early 1970s, and changing the workplace, flex time, men staying home for periods and taking care of children, all of this, that kind of thing. What was the point of women prepping for careers and jobs if there was no way to raise children and have a career at the same time? It's the problem that Americans still haven't solved. So there were a bunch of books that came out afterwards that were mainly her speeches, and they're not good books. They're not organically composed like the Feminine Mystique, and they tend to be long sentences that might be electrifying in person, but on the page are sort of gummy and repetitive. And then as she got older, she became obsessed with what she took to be the prejudice against older people, which she took as seriously as earlier as the prejudice against women, and wrote a long study called The Fountain of Age in 1993, and she thought generally that those over 60 had been subjected to the same kind of underestimation that women had been subjected to for centuries. I'm not sure the book is worth reading at this point because, I looked at it, of course, but I think the medical evidence that she draws on has all been superseded. Her life in the Hamptons began in 1970 when she was raising money for the what was going to be a strike originally, and turned into a march in New York in August 1970, down Fifth Avenue, a very large crowd. It was a moment. It was very widely covered. There were men in the media, like, anyone remember Howard K. Smith on ABC? He was very sarcastic about it. I think it was the moment when the media realized the women's movement was not going away ever, that it was changing the culture permanently. Anyway, she'd raised money here in the Hamptons. She and her daughter, Emily, the third of her children, she's a pediatrician in Buffalo, Emily, rented a big house, and they did that for several years, and other friends, they were it was sort of the post-divorce set. They were a group of friends. They were media types, some academics, writers, and they would rent a big house and formed what Betty called a respectable non-hippie commune. It started in Sagaponack, then there was one in Wainscott, Betty didn't do much shopping or cooking. You know, someone else can make the chicken salad or take out the garbage, but she organized conversations among smart people. It broke up after some years, I think, not because of personal disputes, but it just became physically difficult to do, or getting people to sign, multiple people to sign a lease or whatever. And in 1978, she bought her house in Sag Harbor on Glover Street, which backs onto the cove, the upper Sag Harbor Cove. Yes, and she would have lunch every day at the Dockside Bar and Grill, which some of you are nodding, just closed its doors a few years ago. It was a good place? Yeah. Great place. Yeah, well, that's where she had lunch. And so Sag Harbor became very important to her in a way that New York was not. I mean, she lived in the Dakota for a while in New York at 72nd Street, and then she tried to build a kind of commune on 93rd Street with Betty Rollins and other people, a series of refurbished brownstones off Central Park. But I really think the Sag Harbor house and the life that she had there with her children and grandchildren and friends made her feel rooted in a way that she never had been before. I mean, she couldn't go home. She went home to Peoria and, you know, lectured them on their sins, but she, you know, it wasn't home. Sag Harbor was home. And she got a long dining room table and opened the doors to the outside so that it was kind of a public conference room, a fresh air division. And she launched what she called the Sag Harbor Initiative, when she invited white and black political activists, held discussions about race, relations, housing, discrimination, sexism. There was no doubt some tart remarks about the relative lack of diversity on the South Fork, and so on. And in old age, she could be seen around town. Emily told me that her daughter, she bought a beat-up car because she knew she would beat it up. Betty Friedan died on February 4th, 1985, on her birthday, 84 years old. She was buried at the Sag Harbor Jewish Cemetery up here. And Hillary Clinton said either that day or the next day, she defined the problem and then had the courage to do something about it. And I think her effect is permanent. I think, there was a lot of ways she was, as I tried to explain, she was cut off from what was going on, but there are other ways in which she changed consciousness, certainly in the matter of how seriously to take Freudian analysis. Suffered a terrible blow, not just from her, but from many feminists. The consciousness of the general sense of what women were capable of as business women, as intellectuals, as many things, and at the same time, of course, she was adamant that women had to have children at the same time. I mean, she wanted everything for women, and she herself prided herself on being a good mom, a super mom, if possible. I mean, there's a kind of striving here that I find heroic, and she was a pain in the neck. There's no doubt about it. I mean, she was diva-ish and demanded the best table, the best car, that kind of thing. It has a tragic side because it wasn't just rivals like Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem that she couldn't get along with. It was the younger women who worked for her. She had no trouble talking to men, and men had no trouble talking. I feel I could have had a conversation with her that would have been fine. It was women, young women, she dominated terribly. There's another, and I find it hard to understand that. And then she would be very apologetic finally in the end, but a lot of younger women who were drawn to her would work for her for a while and then leave. And there was something screwy in her personal life. Well, she was very insistent, particularly in the late 60s and early 70s, at the time of radical feminism, on her enjoyment of sex with men. She was very clear about that, insistent on it, and after she finally got rid of her lousy husband, she vamped men of appropriate age at parties, and so on. She was not in any way a Puritan. She loved physical pleasure, and she loved food, and she loved comfort, but there was this internal drive that I tried to describe before that would not let her rest and would not let anyone else rest. So she was very, she made life for women in some ways harder, not easier, because liberty, as Simone de Beauvoir said this, would provide the necessity of choosing in a way that wasn't true necessarily for many women earlier than that. In other words, it didn't necessarily make for liberty, didn't necessarily make for happiness. So the scandal that I just started to tell you about and stopped was that her marriage to Carl, who seems to have been a very promising young man. It was called Friedan. He dropped the M and made it Friedan because it sounded less Jewish. They got married and lived on 86th Street, 2 blocks from where I live. And the marriage was very successful in the beginning, and they had 3 marvelous children. But it was mutually abusive, both sides. He hit her and she hit him. And in her autobiography, I think it's called Life So Far, which I certainly studied very carefully, she sort of took responsibility, or partial responsibility, for the incessant fights that they had. They would throw crockery at each other, and she would chase him up and down the beach with a knife, and all this kind of scandal. I mean, that the most famous feminist in the country was living inside an abusive marriage was something, of course, that her friends knew, but she kept quiet. And it was a great relief when she finally got rid of him, and she spent the next 20 years of her life. She had a long love affair with a married professor and so on. She was very, very active, and as I say, vamped men of appropriate age into her 70s. So, I mean, I think she's a heroine, and even if she was a bloody pain in the neck about half the time, and I think she had a permanent effect on all of us, and it was at times difficult to write about her, but it was certainly easier to write about Mel Brooks. And if you want me to tell you Mel's stories, I will. Or let me say just what we're talking about, the importance of family for Betty. Norman Mailer, who had 6 wives and 9 children, okay, for all his philandering, was a great father. He was like an upper middle class Jewish father like any other, insisted his kids go to school, not do drugs, and I've met them all, and they're all in good shape. So I just want to lay that one to rest for all his reputation as a brawler and a drunk, which is really not true. He was a good father. In fact, well, you know how painfully Lenny was a father. I mean, if you saw Maestro, which is based on mostly on Jamie Bernstein, his daughter, her book, Famous Father Girl, That movie, people complain. I liked it a lot. Brad Cooper's Maestro. It's when you make a biopic, you have to have a plot. If you have someone with a life as various as Leonard Bernstein's, you can't just jump from, oh, he was in Broadway, oh, he was a super Jew, oh, he was an Israelite, oh, he was a civil rights advocate. You know, you would have nothing. What you would have is one of the many documentaries about him that already exist. What they decided to do was to tell a family story of a tragic marriage, and I thought they told it well. But all of these, Mel made an early marriage. I don't know why I'm talking about families, but just seemed, since I started with Betty, Mel made an early marriage but was much too young and had 3 children from his first marriage that he only reconciled with maybe in the last 20 years. But then he, of course, was married to Anne Bancroft for 43 years, and they have a son who is a well-known writer. So these are all family people, and the frame of the book is that they broke with the kind of cultural situation of their parents, Jewish immigrants, Eastern European immigrants, and at the same time they reaffirmed them. That's the paradox I was working with throughout the book. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I can refill that if you like.
What's that?
I can refill your water if you like.
Yeah.
Can you take a few questions?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, we have time for a few questions. What a complex subject Betty must have been. You did write that that chapter was most enjoyable for you. I'm curious about that, but we're going to welcome your questions.
Well, yes, if anyone
Yeah.
comment or questions. No.
Howard, please jump right in.
Betty was a neighbor of ours in Sag Harbor.
Uh-oh.
And this is an anecdote. This is a typical Betty anecdote. Betty used to want to ride a bike, and she had a bike for probably a 6 or 8 year old. I said, Betty, that's really small. She said, well, I'm afraid of I'll fall off. In fact, I'm having trouble because my knees hit the handlebars, which is true. So I said to her, Betty, let's raise the seat. No, I'll fall. I said, this is true. I says, I'll raise the seat and you'll try it. And I raised the seat. She says, oh, I can ride it. And that was my
All right, well, you made a major contribution. Sounds like.
If you called me, you could have written it your book.
I could have, yeah. Yeah. Yes. All right.
No, I have to say something. I think what you have revealed is masterful. I grew up at the time that all of that was happening, and I remember, as I was mentioning on my way here today, I just went like this. I was raising kids. I didn't want to know anything about whatever was happening out there with women. But now, as I see these younger women, recognizing what this woman was able to do and proceeded to do.
They are the inheritors.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Yeah, my wife was a lawyer and is now a novelist, Susan Rieger, and my first wife, Kathy Shine, who's written 12 novels. All you have to do is listen. Really, that's it. That's the secret. They grew up, and some friends of ours who were about women lawyers who were the same age. They went to Columbia Law School when it finally opened its doors to more than just a handful of women, that kind of thing. They didn't read feminist texts. They seized the opportunities that were there, and they're a little puzzled now because they wonder if the next just exactly what you're saying, the next 2 generations realize how much has changed and how much has been gained. Of course, the current administration is trying. It seems to me it's best to reaffirm a kind of earlier notion of macho, and to push women back into into the houses, but that's a whole other story, isn't it? Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
One thing I was waiting to hear, but I didn't in your remarks, was as a woman who grew up I went to college in 1968, and I can tell you the differences that all of us as women now see on a daily basis. I remember when I was in school, you had like 5 women in law school. Like when Liz Holtzman went to Harvard, she was one of 5 women.
Right.
So on and so forth. Now half the class is women. The same way, like
It's like 60%. 60%.
60%. You see, women are, they're everything. So, you're not just a husband and a father, but it's the same thing. A woman is a wife, a mother, a lawyer, a this, that. And why not? I think it's about time that people see this as
It doesn't make life easier, though. It doesn't. That was what de Beauvoir said in 1949.
life is never easy.
She said, I'm interested in liberty, not in happiness. That's what de Beauvoir said in 1949. And Betty came to that conclusion. If you read the last chapter of the Feminine Mystique, she knows how hard it's going to be. Yes?
Which you just said, all those women had daycare.
Well,
They
yeah,
did. The poor people.
Remember when you couldn't even get daycare?
Right.
There you go.
But you had somebody living in, you had their way, if you had the financial means to do it.
Yeah.
Whereas the lower class, I mean, they have to take
No
whatever job.
opportunity.
No opportunity.
Everyone scrambles
Everybody
from one
else
week to the next. I'll take care of your kids on Tuesday, you take care of my kids on Wednesday, that kind of thing. That's what I hear. It's a scramble. It's a real scramble, yeah. The Swedes were right, I mean, in a way, when she went to see them in 1967. Sir?
Yeah, I hope, I am a feminist, at least I believe I am, and so I don't want anyone to boo me when I make this comment. A lot of things have unintended consequences.
Of course.
And when I was growing up, I'm 84, and all of my teachers in kindergarten, public school, high school, they were all, not all, but 98% of them were women.
Yeah. Because that's what you could do.
They were great
They were good.
because they couldn't get other jobs. Between the Vietnam War, which resulted in a lot of men going into teaching,
Huh.
and the opportunities that were now available to women as a result of everything that has occurred, there have been a lot of issues in education, and I don't blame it all on this, and it's certainly an unintended consequence, but it is a consequence.
Yeah. Yes, of course. Yes. Someone else?
Live in society.
Yes, we do. Anyone else? All right, well, thank you all for coming. Can I tell you one Mel story? Come on. It's 1954 or 55. He's working for Sid Caesar, the famous writer's room. Sid Caesar at time had this extraordinary collection of writers working for him, including the very young Woody Allen, including the very young Neil Simon. Anyway, they're walking across 57th Street near Carnegie Hall. And the writer on his left is, yes, I forget, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name, and Neil Simon is on his right. They're all kids, they're young, no one has heard of them. And Mel was in the center, and 3 nuns were approaching them across 57th Street. And the guy on Mel's left said, "No, Mel, no." And he said, "What? What are you talking?" And Neil Simon said, "Will you get hold of you?" He said, "Nothing. I don't understand what." The nuns come up close. I'm sorry, I'm going to blow the story. They're writing sketches for Sid, this great, your show of shows with the sketches with Imogen Coca and so on. They're sketch writers. Anyway, the 3 nuns are coming towards him, and he leaps out at them, and he says, "Take off those costumes. The nuns' sketch is out." So I said to him, how did they react? And he said, they hit the ground. So he'll be 100 years old in a month.